Our gospel today comes from Luke chapter 24. On the first day of the week, at early dawn, the women came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again." Then they remembered Jesus' words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in. He saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home amazed at what had happened. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. Our stories, our experiences are important. The stories we tell ourselves, the experiences we share, the idle tales that we dismiss, and the testimonies we believe. Stories give power and purpose and meaning to our lives. The story of the Son of Man, the Son of God, divine and yet human, the God who made God's self-flesh to come and dwell among us. The story of a God who misses God's people, who wants to share in their stories, in their experiences, in their very lives. A God who would be handed over to sinners, to the very people that God made and loved and cared for in all their brokenness. A Son who would be crucified, who would face the worst stories we tell, and would rise again on that 3rd day. So when I talk about this story, when I talk about Jesus' story, what always stands out to me the most is that Jesus, throughout the Gospels, tells his disciples, tells anyone who will listen, really, what's going to happen. He tells them over and over again on the 3rd day, he tells them over and over again that the Son of Man will suffer, will die. And throughout all of this, the disciples rarely believe him, right? They kind of just assume this is part of his dramatic rhetoric for his preaching and teaching. And so even as he is sitting down with the outcasts, as he's healing, as he's pointing to this Holy Week that we observe as a church, it's really interesting that when the worst part of the story happens, when the Son of Man is killed, the apostles, the witnesses to the trauma, all of his followers sort of forgot the ending. As the remaining 11 disciples and other followers are gathered alone in a house to grieve, the women go to do their work. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and some other women, whoever they might be, went to conclude the story of Jesus by finally preparing his body. They brought their spices with them, grieving the ending that they didn't see coming. And then their story changes, because as they arrive at the tomb, the stone is rolled away. And seeing this, they think, oh, maybe someone's helping us by having the stone moved so that way we can go and prepare the body, since we weren't able to do that. And so they go into the tomb, and there's nothing there. It's empty. And I imagine them frantically searching, like picking up cloths, looking underneath any kind of stones, wondering what this new twist in the story could mean. Perplexed, confused, I wonder if they ask themselves, how? How could this happen? And then suddenly there's these 2 two guys in dazzling clothes like angels standing in front of them. If you're in a group of women and you're inside a cave that you expected to have a dead body in and there was not a dead body, and now there's two random guys appearing out of nowhere, yeah, I'd be terrified too, so I don't blame them for this. Their terror is also awe. They're amazed at what they're seeing, and before they can even say anything, the angels say to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you." Remember how he told you. They're telling the women that they know this story. They're living it. Sometimes we forget the important stories we've been told, whether it's because of grief, anger, sorrow, or the realities of trauma in our lives. We forget. We can even change what we remember, right? The human memory is very flawed. And for the disciples, for these women who were followers of Jesus, their memories had left them, as it does for us sometimes too. But when the women hear these words, "Remember how," that was all it took. Sometimes it takes someone else to help us remember our stories. When we face grief or sorrow, we need someone else to help us remember how that person we lost laughed. When we're facing trauma or a broken heart, having someone say, "Remember how many people are there for you. You're not alone." When faced with all the twists and turns that our life story might take, sometimes having someone simply say, "Remember that you are loved," can help you find just a slow breath, help you find your place. Now for Mary and Joanna and Mary, all the women who were with them, this moment of remembering reminded them that this wasn't just Jesus' story. It was their story too. Their story of this son, this divine person who walked with them, who died in front of them, whose tomb was empty. And so they returned to the 11 disciples and the rest, and they told their story. And like so often happens when people on the margins share their stories or their experiences, they were immediately dismissed. These words seemed to them an idle tale, gossip, make-believe. The women can't handle their grief or their emotions. The Greek word here that is used to describe idle tale is, well, it's a curse word that is very similar to baloney, if you catch my drift. Garbage. I wonder if one of the disciples was thinking, "Yeah, wouldn't that be nice?" Or, "Yeah, okay, I'm sure that's what you saw, okay." I think that we know those kinds of experiences, trying to tell our stories, trying to listen to other stories, but failing to do so. And it's a pretty common reaction to faith stuff, too. The story of Jesus' death and resurrection, what it means for us, sometimes it's hard for us to even get the words out for what that means for us as an individual. But also, I've been in those disciples' shoes. Most of you know that for most of my life, I thought of Jesus and faith as a really nice story. I found myself attending Easter Sunday worship with my mom out of obligation and often bribery. Bribery works. I would just be waiting for the pastor to stop talking, wondering why the Wi-Fi was so bad, or how many doodles I could fit into a single bulletin. And if that's you today, it's okay. We're glad you're here. If that's you every Sunday, we're still glad you're here. It's okay, I promise your secret's safe with me. But I would listen to the sermon, watching the people around me, and I would think, "Oh, isn't that nice?" It's in our nature to dismiss the stories and experiences that don't perfectly match up with our own. As a whole, in our society and in our churches, we fail to listen with believing ears to those who share experiences filled with hard truths. We struggle to hear experiences from people who are different from us, whether that's because of their gender, orientation, race, or ethnicity, background, and especially sometimes age. For the disciples, it's a hard truth that their story isn't over yet, which should be good news. It should be good news that these women are able to share this story. But I wonder if they thought, if Jesus really did rise from the dead, why would the women be first? Why would they be the first to know? Why didn't Jesus come talk to one of the disciples? Why didn't he come talk to Peter? Why didn't these angels show up for us? And whatever reason they found to dismiss the women's testimony, still stories have power and purpose and meaning. And at least one of the disciples heard the women because Peter does go to find out what's going on. Maybe it's because he really believed the story that these women were sharing. Maybe it's because he remembered just how accurate Jesus' prediction of his own betrayal had been. And maybe started to remember that Jesus had told them over and over again about this 3-day stuff. Maybe Peter was just desperate to change his own story as the failed disciple. Whatever the reason, the truth of the women's words got Peter up and running, stooping in and looking inside an empty tomb, terrified, amazed, in awe of what he found. And as Peter goes on to share this story, this experience of life and death and new life with Jesus, we find him in our reading from Acts, preaching to Gentiles. Because like many stories, Jesus' story was being made into something it was never meant to be. His upside-down kingdom of the poor and the meek, of the outcasts and the marginalized, was being turned into something that was only for a few. The early church was drawing a line in the sand and saying that if you weren't this way, if you didn't convert to the old laws, if your life story didn't match up quite the way we wanted it to with ours, then Jesus' story wasn't for you. And Peter goes to those who thought maybe Jesus wasn't for them, and he tells them the story of Jesus. He says, I truly understand that God shows no partiality. This God who made us, who made all people, is for all people. Every nation, every person who finds awe in God, who does what is right, has a valuable story to God. God through Jesus is a story of peace, a story of one God for all and of all. And that message wasn't just for one group or one area or one people, but it traveled. The story of Jesus' anointing and baptism, the story of his care and healing, of God's presence with Jesus through all of it, his death and his resurrection were not just for a few. And God chose the followers of Jesus who would be least likely to be believed to be the first witness to the empty tomb, the first to tell the story. We are all made up of these stories. And those women, Mary, Joanna, Mary, and all the rest, are part of our story too. And sometimes when we forget the ending, when we forget Jesus' words, when we forget the stories and experiences that shape us or that matter to us, like an amnesia that comes over us, sometimes we need to be reminded, to remember how we're not alone, to remember how loved we are. Sometimes we ignore the important stories that are shared with us by others. We dismiss them as garbage or baloney, as idle tales, because we can't understand them yet. We see it as not for us, not representing us, not part of our faith story, and so therefore not acceptable. Sometimes we take the stories of faith of our own lives or the lives of others and we twist them into something they were never meant to be. Sometimes we fail to listen and welcome those in our lives who most need our care. And sometimes we don't even realize how harmful our words or actions can be. But today, on Easter Sunday, as we celebrate Jesus' resurrection, all of us are reminded of the importance of our stories, our experiences, and the grace and love and promise that is flowing throughout them. We are reminded that in Jesus' story, we too have a place. It's not just the women who discovered the empty tomb. It's not just Peter. It's not just the early church. It's our story, your story, my story, God's story. The God who cares for us, who wants to share in our stories with us. And when the Son of God faces the cross, for you and for me and for all people, when Jesus takes on our failures, our selective amnesia, our dismissiveness, our tendencies to twist and turn stories, all of that garbage that we carry, Jesus leaves behind an empty tomb with a new story, a new hope, a new life. And so we get to celebrate because our story continues with Jesus. And maybe that's in sharing in Jesus' ministry, doing good and providing healing for others. Maybe it's just in sharing your own story, your own experiences, even if you might get dismissed or ignored or worse, knowing that God is still present there with you. Maybe it's in telling Jesus' story and why it matters to you. And maybe today the part you play is simply one of celebration and gratitude for the power and purpose and gift of an empty tomb. Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed. Hallelujah.
Thanks be to God.